Chapter 32, Section 1 covers the skeletal system, which are our notes today. These notes are going to be a little bit beefy because we are not only going to cover function and structure, but I'm also going to be labeling the bones of the skeletal system that you are required to memorize. So starting with functions, the skeletal system supports the body. It protects internal organs. It provides movement. And the areas where movement is allowed are called joints. And we'll get back to joints in just a second. And also to backtrack really quickly, organs that your skeletal system protects examples are the brain, the lungs, the heart, really important things that you really don't want damaged. And then jumping back down to D, your skeletal system stores minerals, especially calcium, that help to provide strength for your skeletal system. It is a site for blood cell formation. And I'm going to just draw a real quick red blood cell here just to help you remember that red blood cells are made in your bones. And something that you might not realize, your bones store fat. So maybe you've heard of a soup bone before, like somebody putting a bone when they're making homemade soup. Soup bones are put into soup to actually provide that fatty flavor, which actually tastes really good. Okay, so scrolling up the structure of a bone, and there's a lot of new words here, so bear with me. I'm going to start off with the word osteocyte. An osteocyte is a bone cell, and that bone cell has become embedded in a calcified matrix of bone material that it has made. Osteo, the prefix osteo means bone, and cyte means cell. Periosteum is a connective tissue that surrounds the bone, almost like a membrane or a sheath, and it's a thin membrane that actually surrounds the bone to provide it just some protection. Compact bone is a dense area of bone that contains those bone cells, those osteocytes. And I will show you where that is in the diagram below in just a second. I'm going to skip 4 and just jump down to 5 for a second. The other type of bone is called spongy bone. And spongy bone is somewhat of a misnomer. It is not spongy and soft. It's actually very strong, but it has many holes like a sponge, where compact bone is solid. And then jumping back to 4, a Haversian canal is almost like a tube or a thin canal through the bone that allows blood vessels and nerves to run. Bone is living tissue, and so it needs to be fed with oxygen and nutrients, and wastes need to be removed. It is not dead tissue. So you have to have blood being able to enter the bone, and you also have nerves that run through the bone as well. Bone marrow is found within the bone. There's 2 types. There's red marrow and there's yellow marrow. Red marrow is what's in charge of making red blood cells. and yellow marrow is what stores fat. So they have two very different functions. They get their name from the coloration. So red marrow is red and yellow marrow is yellow. Lastly, an osteon is a ring-like formation that osteocytes make in compact bone. Now, I know I went over that pretty fast, so the easiest way to understand where all of these structures are is in the pictures below. So first of all, on the left-hand side, you have a bone here. And if you look at this bone picture, I'm going to get my highlighter out, you can see spongy bone. And I'm going to make a note that in spongy bone is where red marrow would be found. Now, spongy bone tends to be at the ends, so if you could see it, it would be down here as well. It tends to be at the ends of a long bone. And we'll get into what a long bone is in a minute, but this is an example of a long bone. Compact bone would be at the edges here, okay? So there'd be compact bone here, and then running down. So the compact bone line is that green line that I just drew. That's compact bone. And then yellow marrow would be found running down the center of the bone, which is also called the shaft. So the red marrow would be found toward the ends of the bone where there is spongy bone, and the yellow marrow would be running down the middle, not in the spongy bone area. Okay, so what the heck is this middle picture? Well, this is a zoomed in diagram of that small circle area. So if we were to zoom in on just that very small circle area, you would have spongy bone, okay, which would be the innermost section. You'd have compact bone, and then the periosteum is down here. That's that sheath I was talking about. That would be a very thin membrane that surrounds the bone. An osteon is a circular structure where each little osteocyte has been formed, essentially is making the osteon. So each of these little black dots that I'm drawing is one osteocyte. So these are the bone cells. And they tend to form these ring-like structures called osteons. And then running down the middle is a Haversian canal where blood vessels and nerves can run because they have to have space in order to get through the bone. Now over here they call it an osteonic canal, and that's just a synonym for Haversian canal. And then on the far right, you see the osteon again. You see the Haversian canal, which is in the middle. So it's empty, but it's not really empty because there'd be blood vessels and nerves running through there. And then the osteocytes are labeled as well. Those little dots are actually bone cells, and their cytoplasm projects out kind of like little crazy spiders. Those are the actual bone cells. And down below, just for reference, you have another bone diagram. You can see spongy bone. You can see the shaft of the bone or the diaphysis. You can see the marrow here, the yellow marrow. There would be red marrow. That would be here at the ends. Yeah, so that's called a long bone. Now moving on to the next page, your skeletal system includes not just bone, but cartilage. Cartilage does not contain blood vessels. It's flexible, whereas bone is not. but yet it is still tough. And it is made up of protein fibers. Now, the benefit of cartilage is it allows for more movement in some appendages, such as the ribs, the tip of the nose, the ears, and where some of your bones meet, and also your respiratory system. If all of your ribs were solid bone, it would be pretty hard to breathe. So you have bone for strength, and you have cartilage that's not only tough, but also flexible to allow for a little bit more movement. Now, there's different kinds of cartilages, but you don't need to know the differences of them for this class. A joint is where one bone attaches to another. There are several types of joints. The first is called an immovable joint. And as its name suggests, there is no movement. A great example is with the plates of your skull were actually separate individual plates that fuse together as you grow from an infant to an older infant. So technically each of those plates is its own bone, but once they fuse, the joint is no longer movable. And then you've got freely movable joints, and of which you need to know 4. The one that provides the most amount of movement in all directions is called a ball and socket. And the femur and the pelvis, as well as the shoulder, are ball and socket joints. That allows for up, down, side, circular motions, so the most flexible. And then there's a hinge joint. A hinge joint is back and forth. Good examples are the knee and your finger. So if you look at your finger, not at the base of your finger where you get a little bit of wiggle side to side. I'm talking about the top 2 joints of your finger where you can just bend back and forth. The third is called a pivot joint. And a pivot joint allows circular motions and rotations. It is where one bone pivots around another. So your upper and lower arm at the elbow, you get a rotation of the radius around the ulna, and that is a pivot. Another place is where your skull meets your spine. So you get a pivot there as well. And I'm not sure if pivot is listed at the bottom on this diagram, but circular rotation is what a pivot is. And then finally, a saddle joint allow for one bone to slide in 2 directions. So another place is your thumb. And that is shown down here, where you get a little bit more rotation than just a back and forth. Oops. So not at the top, not the top 2, but down here at the lower part of the thumb. Now, I'm going to briefly touch upon some skeletal system disorders. You can have loss of calcium in the bone as you age, and that is called osteoporosis. And you can also have tears that happen to the connective tissue that holds bone to bone. You can also have breaks. So I didn't type that, but you can add it. You can actually just have fractures of the bone. But again, bone is living tissue. So if you have a break, as long as you keep the bone stable, the break will fill in with new bone. But the tears that can happen to connective tissue that hold bone to bone and muscle to bone, Those tears can happen to ligaments and tendons. A ligament actually connects bone to bone. So perhaps you've heard of an MCL or an ACL. Those are ligaments. They end in an L, and that kind of helps denote what they do. And a tendon connects muscle to bone. I have a picture of the knee here only because there's a few ligaments here that maybe you've heard of. So if you're looking at a knee joint, the patella is the kneecap, the femur is the thigh bone, and then the shin bone down below is the tibia. And outside of the tibia, there is another bone that runs on the outside of the lower leg called the fibula. There's a whole bunch of tendons and ligaments that are shown here, but the one that maybe you've heard of that we're just going to mention in our class is the ACL and the MCL. And I'm going to highlight in a different color where they are. The ACL is right here. It's toward the front of the femur and the tibia, holding them together. And the MCL, barely visible here, but it's on the inside of your knee, again, holding the tibia and the femur together. And any blow to the leg, or just possibly like a awkward juking motion, where, you know, maybe you're playing basketball, or maybe if you were playing football or soccer, you take a hit and the knee has an awkward bend to it in either direction. That can put strain on these ligaments and actually cause them to break away from the bone. And in that case, sometimes surgery is required to repair those ligaments. Fun fact, sometimes they'll take tendons from one part of the body and actually move them into those locations, and the body will chemically change them over time to ligaments. Now, lastly, bones come in different categories based on their shape. There are long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and a sesamoid bone, the largest being the patella. I'll come back to that one. Now, long bones are longer than wide. And a great example is your humerus, which is your upper arm bone, which is shown in the picture. And your femur, your tibia, and your fibula. Short bones are cubed shaped. They're short, not long. And good example are your carpals and tarsals. So your carpals are in your wrist and your tarsals are in your ankle. Flat bones are flat on either side of the bone. And the frontal bone of your skull is actually very flat. Your ribs, your sternum, which is in the middle of your chest, and your scapula, which is your shoulder blade, is also a flat bone. Then you have irregular shaped bones. They have no specified shape. Good examples are your vertebrae, which is shown here, as well as your mandible, that's your lower jaw. And then finally, kind of a strange one is a sesamoid bone. It gets its own category. By definition, a sesamoid bone is a bone embedded inside a tendon. And many of these bones are extremely tiny. Sometimes they form due to a muscle pulling on a bone over and over time. But the largest sesamoid bone is your patella, which is your kneecap. Now on the next page, we're going to label the bones that you're responsible for knowing in our class. I'm going to start on the left-hand side, and I'm going to work counterclockwise going around this diagram. So our first bone, I'm going to highlight it, is this right here. Let's see if I can make that a little bit less big. Here we go. That is called your clavicle. You can feel your clavicle if you put your hand kind of from your shoulder and go forward along kind of like your neckline in a way. But not high up your neck, kind of like down in the front, like you're going to go towards your chest. The bone, and I'm going to change colors here, down the middle here is called your sternum. Continuing down, we have vertebrae. And then over here in the hand, we have your phalanges, which are your fingers. And then we have your wrist bones. So let me highlight those. And your wrist bones are called your carpals. Moving further down, we have your pelvis. And the bone that makes half of the pelvis is called the ilium, and that's an I. You can also say iliac crest, and that's acceptable too, and I'm going to highlight that. And I'm going to write ilium. Continuing down on the left side, we have the patella. That's your kneecap. And then the bones that make up the ankle are called the tarsals. And this line is not great, so this is meant to be back here. Oh shoot, that's not a highlighter. Sorry about that. Let me do like a blue. Moving off to the side, your toes are also called your phalanges. And then in the middle of the foot, so not where, oops, so far back. So right about here. So kind of like the middle section of your foot, but not where your foot meets your leg and not your toes. Those are called the metatarsals. And we are not going to learn the names of all of these bones in the body. You just have to know some of the actual bones you need to know the name of. Some of them are groups, and you just need to know the group name, like tarsals and metatarsals. Moving up on the right side, we've got your shin bone. That's your tibia. And the little bone off to the side is fibula. Make sure you spell those correctly. Tibia does not have an L. Fibula does not have an I. I remember that the fibula is the little bone on the side of the tibia, and it makes me think a fib is a little lie. So the fibula is a little bone. And let me quickly highlight those. So here's the tibia. And here's the fibula. And then the femur is the largest bone, the long bone in the body. And we are actually going to divide this label into two because there's actually two bones here. So this first line that's actually labeling this, but not the very, very bottom. It's called the sacrum. And then just below it is your tailbone, which is called your coccyx. C-O-C-C-Y-X. And I'll see if I can highlight that a different color. I'll do red right there. And I just realized that this arrow, I'm so sorry, the arrows are not especially clear. They wanted this to be the metacarpals on this side. So let's fix that real quick. I'm sorry. The palm, this was pointing to the palm area, and I misinterpreted that. So those are called the metacarpals. And on this side, that's where the arrow was pointing to the wrist bone. So we'll change that. Those are the carpals. Okay, so we're almost done here. The next thing I need you to write is R-T-U-P, R-TUP. And what R-TUP is going to stand for is radius, thumb, ulna, pinky. That's going to help you remember what bone is where when you are trying to look at the lower arm. So I'm looking at this lower arm and I see the thumb. So I'm going to put a T for the thumb and I'm going to put a P for the pinky. And the radius is on the thumb side and the ulna is on the pinky side. So let me get my highlighter. I see a bone here on the thumb side. And I see, well, let's use a different color besides orange. Let's do blue. I see a bone here on the pinky side. So on the thumb side, remember, radius is on the thumb side. That's this one. And the bone that's on the pinky side is the ulna. I also remembered ulna elbow. The bone that gives you your elbow is your ulna. Don't worry about this one. Your upper arm bone is your humerus, but not spelled the same as funny. Oh, that's not a highlighter. The next bone is in the back of the body, but you can still see it here a little bit. Let's do gray. That's your scapula. And I skipped one, your ribs. Your lower jaw is your mandible. And the top part of your skull is called your cranium. And those are all the bones that you are responsible for. Make sure you correct the metacarpals and the carpals. Those were accidentally switched at the beginning, but I fixed it already. And you are going to definitely need to practice. So the best way to do that is getting a blank skeletal diagram and practice labeling it as many times as you need so that you remember all your